So it's a thought experiment, and it goes, would you choose effective justice that helps everyone and makes the world a better place, but when you hurt someone, you always get caught and you face consequences 100% of the time? Would you choose that? Or would you choose basically what we have now, which is really quite ineffective justice, where some people are punished really disproportionately and most victims don't get satisfying results, but you do sometimes get away with things, and you often get away with the little things.
Okay, and what's the point? That we think we want justice, but we don't actually want justice?
I don't know if that's the point. I don't know if there is a point. But if you look at them as two separate optional worlds, here's one, here's the other, black and white. There's a difference between how we view what we want, which is justice, versus what we actually want, which is maybe having an easy life and getting away with things.
So it's not black and white. How we view it is black and white, but what we want is some third thing.
Like red.
I don't know. I think it feels more like the difference between the perspective of a person who has done harm and a person who has been harmed. You know, like how when you're walking, all of the drivers are maniacs, and when you're driving, all of the pedestrians are clueless. When you've been harmed, we may be really dead set on justice, but when we've perpetuated harm, suddenly our values shift.
Yeah.
We take your two worlds. Let's call one black and white, that's the wrongdoer's world, and let's call one red, that's the victim's world. They're very different. Perpetrators get away with things, and victims get left wondering what to do with themselves.
What about the people who've perpetrated harm and actually want to make up for it? Not the assholes who don't care, but people who actually want to take accountability.
For I believe absolutely that justice is indivisible, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
You're a good person, right? Right? You're a good person. You deserve love. I mean, even if you weren't a good person, you'd deserve love, wouldn't you? Doesn't everyone deserve love? Then again, if love isn't in any way based on goodness, if it's completely detached from manifesting any of the goodness in this world, then what would love even be? It would be sapped of meaning then, right? Just a symptom of proximity, a mandatory attachment between people who happen to bump into one another on the long road of life. And if we don't have to be good or indeed be or do anything to have a relationship with love, we just get it automatically, then what does it even mean to be a person worthy of love? Everyone's worthy, so no one is worthy. What does it mean in that context to be good? I mean, there's no difference between me and a person doing great evil in terms of being a good person who deserves love, provided that person is in proximity to people who are attached to them, or that I'm not in proximity to people who have a mandatory obligation to love me. Oh, these moral relativists, they can't let us have anything. You can't do a proof for the meaninglessness of love and goodness. There must have been some verbal trickery there. Well, yes, there was. I used love as a noun and good as an adjective. It was very sneaky, because they are both things you do. The being of love and of good only happen in terms of what is done with them. That is, they exist in action and in the relationships between things. When we use good as an adjective, outside of the context of, you know, bush babies are good or the string cheese incident is good, when we use moral good as an adjective in I am a good person, what we're saying is I am a person who does good, who makes good, and fights on the behalf of good. And love, I'll come back to you on love. When I was in the second grade, so age 7, a girl in my class was throwing a birthday party and had invited all of my friends, but not me. We were friendly, but we weren't really friends, and it made sense even then that I wasn't invited, but I wasn't happy about it. There are some things I could have done. I could have talked to her about it. I could have used it as an opportunity to make sure I was making more social connections going forward. I didn't do those things. What I did was intercept her mom and complain. and I got an invite to the party, which I definitely did not deserve, and at that party I was very well behaved and nice. No. What I was desperately aware that I shouldn't be there, and so I was compensating. One of the activities of the night was baking her birthday cake ourselves. Devil's food. We did this crowded around her mom and drinking red Chucklin cherry Squeeze-Its. Those were these little terrifying looking plastic bottles which you'd squeeze to gush this terrible neon sugar drink into your mouth.
Chucklin cherry Squeeze-Its.
They were a real thing.
It's quite a good drag queen name.
As we were mixing, someone squeezed theirs too hard and accidentally squirted a bit into the cake mix. My friend's mum, ever the cheerful parent, made a joke that had everyone laughing. It was no big deal, an extra bit of flavor. Sensing my chance for comedy, I grabbed my drink and squirted across the table, a big wave of artificial neon red landing right in the mixing bowl. The girls did not laugh. I recognized my mistake right away and tried to make my own joke, tried to minimize it. But when the cake came out of the oven, it was reddish brown and tasted like cherry. The birthday girl put her slice down and didn't eat it.
Did that really happen? It's such a sad cake story.
It's uncomfortable to have hurt someone. I actually still think about that birthday party all the time. It's a practice story I call up if I want to make myself feel terrible. And there are practice things I tell myself to try and make myself feel better. You weren't intending to harm anyone. It was so long ago, she probably doesn't even remember. Forgive yourself, etc. And it's tempting, but the fact is, I don't think I ever apologized. I don't think I did anything to make amends. I didn't do anything to go through the process of restitution. And because of that, I carry it with me. And that's not me torturing myself. It isn't irrational to feel guilt or self-blame in the aftermath of having hurt another human being. And frankly, often when we're talking about harm, we're talking about actions more intense than just ruining a birthday cake. As a white person, my relationship with whiteness comes up in different contexts to the situations where people from other ethnicities are made aware of their relationship to being African American or Colombian or Jewish or a traveler or what have you. In the US where I'm from, or in Ireland where I live, whiteness is largely taken as the cultural norm and the white experience is taken as normative. As a consequence, white people are usually only aware of the experience of whiteness when someone else makes them aware of a different racial experience. That is, our white identity tends to only become salient when we fuck up. In a study that looked at white fragility through the lens of emotional regulation, we got this tidy summary.
We propose that the core appraisals, when combined, are sufficient for generating white fragility emotional response, goal relevance, goal incongruence, and low coping potential. Specifically, we propose that white fragility emotional responses arise when situations where a white person's race is salient to them are appraised as A, relevant to their goal to be viewed positively, B, incongruent with their goal to be viewed positively. For example, someone thinks they said something racist, and yet C, they do not think they have the resources to successfully handle the situation. For example, they do not think they can manage the situation to avoid being viewed as racist.
The goal being appraised there is to be seen as a good, not racist person who deserves love. The goal incongruence is an experience that contradicts this self-image. Say, someone pointing out that what you're doing is racist, and the lack of resources to successfully handle the situation, while more complex, is essentially the plethora of ways in which our attempts to handle the situation become mishandling the situation. And there really is a plethora of fragile ways to mishandle this situation. Disengagement, for example, covers a large range of responses. This can take the form of strategic colorblindness, where white people will avoid identifying people by race, even if it's a useful identifying feature and totally value neutral. In studies evaluating how we identify each other, where white participants seemed to avoid using race as an identifying feature, the white participants were rated by black participants as less friendly, because, it seemed, they also displayed avoidant nonverbal behaviors. The mental gymnastics required to avoid race also seem to increase cognitive load so much that they lead to temporary cognitive impairment. Another form of disengagement is just to avoid engaging with a black colleague or teacher, who might have, at some point, drawn your attention to this interracial discomfort. This can create animosity with the black people in your community, as well as further alienate you from the experiences outside of the white norm. In the short term, this can reduce intergroup anxiety, but in the long term, it can increase that anxiety. Another way that we can mismanage our own emotional regulation is by attempting to manage the emotional regulation of others, or extrinsic emotional regulation. This can take the form of active vocal minimization or redirection of the harm you've done, pointing the finger at the woke scold, overreacting, making a new collective joke of their reaction, and so on. Such instances of Black people having to manage their anger have been described as affective injustice. And again, there's short-term gain for the white person in disengaging with their discomfort, but there are long-term interpersonal and societal consequences. White students who were taught about white privilege tended to rate those teachers more negatively. And again, that's likely because of the way those students are interacting with their own discomfort. And as you know, how educators are rated by their students can have massive implications for their career. And that's just page 1 of the gatekeeping role that white people can have on the lives of Black people. Disengagement practices for white people are also institutionalized. In 2021, US legislators introduced laws to limit how teachers can talk about race in the classroom, and the wording they used for why is very telling. To help students avoid the emotional discomfort, guilt, anguish, or another form of psychological distress associated with confronting racism. And it doesn't take much of a leap in logic to jump from that example to all the potentially devastating impacts on other marginalized groups. Male fragility, straight fragility, cis fragility, and so on. All the ways that we disengage from our own discomfort and manufacture worse consequences for those around us, as well as negative outcomes for ourselves in the long term. A person in a normative group can have tremendous power over a minority group, or any kind of outgroup, even if they don't know it. And with that power comes the responsibility to deal with your discomfort in a way that doesn't make the life worse for the members of that outgroup, even if what you're actually doing is a misguided attempt to manage your own anxiety and guilt, even if all it feels like you're doing is defending the fact that you're a good person who deserves love. Owning harm is the only alternative. Having a humble and healthy relationship with the harm that you do, have done, can do, will do, is the long-term most beneficial, most good reaction to discovering that harm has been done. The conditions for fragility involve a combination of seeing yourself as a good person and having that self-image contradicted, and perceiving your resources as insufficient to deal with it. From that same great paper on white fragility.
One viable way to avoid the harm that these strategies can cause within this context is to question the premise that one needs to get rid of their discomfort in the first place. Example, to problematize the notion of comfort in this context. Rather than trying to avoid one's emotions, one can accept one's emotions. Notably, we do not suggest that emotional acceptance is not an end in itself, but rather is a first step that can allow for more productive subsequent responses.
So you can reframe your self-image in terms of how you deal when harm is pointed out to you. You can reframe the idea of retaining that image of a good self as an ongoing project of development, change, and transformation. And you can view your own resources to deal with mistakes as being partly made up of the community and external resources around you. That is, education, history, knowledge, therapy. Look, I'm not saying that this is easy. In fact, a large part of this essay is going to be us proselytizing about hard work and boring routines and how thankless it is to work on yourself. But reframing your self-image really does function to prevent harm. Believing first that a situation has happened, and second, that you do have the resources to make the bad thing good, are in themselves tools to make the bad thing good. And reframing emotions like guilt and anxiety, especially around something like racism, can redirect a painful and directionless experience into one with purpose and hope again. Our emotions are supposed to be socially useful. We feel guilt and remorse and pain because something has to change. But you might be feeling something else too. Worry for yourself, because to own harm is the first step in a series of steps. And once you admit that, once you own the harm, you may be looking down the barrel of a lot of unpleasant things you have to do, like having to do work, having to change things, or having to accept consequences. You may lose social capital, access to spaces, friendships. It isn't nice to admit, but our thoughts after harming someone can turn inward towards self-protection, towards trying to avoid negative consequences. This is actually pretty normal. This would likely fall under the umbrella of what psychologists call the psychological immune system. essentially a set of interlocking cognitive systems that work to help us maintain positive self-regard. And yeah, that's helpful when the thing you did was fail a geography test or miss a football goal. But these same systems can make it harder for us to take accountability for actions in a process that some researchers call pseudo-self-forgiveness. Essentially, when we're having to face the knowledge that we've perpetrated harm, there are a number of mechanisms that we can default to in order to not feel badly. These are methods such as rationalization. The other girl probably already had ruined the cake already. Justification. Well, it wasn't fair of me to have not been invited. Minimization. It's just a cake. This is called pseudo-self-forgiveness for a reason. Real self-forgiveness is only something you'd achieve if you faced what you did and dealt with the consequences. You will be denying yourself the chance to gain insight from emotions such as guilt, shame, or regret, and get caught up in them as feelings instead of signs of responsibility. So when you've harmed someone, you are, in essence, faced with a choice. You can acknowledge the ways you've allowed yourself to commit harm and walk the road of retribution. Or you could let negative emotions like guilt hamper you from engaging directly. And research seems to show that's actually bad for you as the perpetrator. Feelings like guilt and shame don't resolve just because they're pushed away, and research seems to indicate that this avoidance can lead to shame-rage spirals or perpetrators being less able to trust themselves. The short-term comfort of being able to say that you are a good person who did nothing wrong seems to be damaging in the long term. Real self-forgiveness isn't about flagellation, but it genuinely seems like there are different psychological outcomes for those perpetrators who face their guilt by acknowledging what they've done, that over time they will have increased self-trust, increased hope, and increased empathy. Those people who ignore harm are not only at risk of repeating their mistakes, but in some ways more doomed to live with the negative emotions associated with them. Shame may be held down, but it's always there, in the periphery, threatening to let loose at any time. I can't convince you to take hurting someone else seriously. I try to be persuasive, but honestly, this is something beyond my power. What I can do is tell you how to contend with hurting someone, because you absolutely have, and you will do it again.
Are you sure you want to talk about this? You don't have to bleed out for a video essay.
I don't want to contribute to a conspiracy of silence. I started a tweet once saying that I was a prison abolitionist. The tweet was about something else. It was the caveat at the start, but many of the responses I got were focused on one specific way that people are harmed. One specific act. So here's your content warning. This section is going to focus on SA. If you don't want to hear about that right now, that's fine. Go ahead, take care of yourself, skip to the next chapter. Because this is YouTube, because the conspiracy of silence around this subject is so omnipresent, I can't use the words I want to use to talk about this, even in a personal educational context. There's an unedited version on Patreon. I don't like to gate off any of our content, but our hand was forced here. So back to it, we're talking about that tweet. I don't remember his exact wording, but one person who was particularly callous put it this way: prison abolitionists? I bet you won't feel that way if you get raped. I have been raped. Twice. Once by a partner, once by a woman who was my friend. Both times were extremely different. The first was in the middle of the night when I'd been so deeply asleep that I was disoriented and I didn't know where I was. The other time I was very, very drunk, and it proceeded in little steps. Me saying, no, stop, and her stopping for a bit until time would pass and she'd just start again, all while I went in and out of drunkenly starting to fall asleep. Part of the process of being raped for me was the long period between having it happen and being able to apply that label to it. I didn't tell anyone about the first until long after my relationship with that person had ended. I told my partner after the second, but not in detail, and full of so many caveats that I found out later that they thought I was telling them that I had had bad sex, rather than unconsensual. Afterwards, in both cases, I continued associating with the person who had raped me, continued the relationship, continued the friendship, told myself not to think about it, told myself that the hurt would go away if I just pushed the memory into a box and forgot. I have ADHD. I forget things all the time. I'll probably forget about this too, but no matter what foolish or self-destructive ways I tried to overwrite the memories, it didn't get better. Because to pretend is not to heal. Years later, a friend group of mine was talking about an acquaintance of ours who had been assaulted. All of us were, to use the term, triggered. We started to exchange the stories of the ways that we had been assaulted ourselves. More than one of us in the middle of the night by a long-term partner, or on dates where it had started willingly and then someone realized they were too drunk and asked for it to stop only for it to not stop. By co-workers after work events, or by friends who were spending the night after they had missed the last train home. Some of us willingly slept with the person again after the assault. Most of us tried to move on instantly and be good sports about the whole thing. All of us took a long, long time before we acknowledged that we had been. It reminds me of a work published anonymously in the Nib called Breakfast. The morning after I was raped, I made my rapist breakfast. Eggs, medium well, and toast, golden brown, and bacon, extra crispy, just the way I liked it. The night before, he hovered over me and said, "So pretty." When I said no, he said, "Why not?" When I asked why he was doing this, he said, "You are just so beautiful." So the morning after, I made him breakfast. There is another story that I like better. I fight. Fuck you. I spit at him. I struggle. In this story, I am brave. But this is not my story, and it is not true, because I am not brave and I did not fight. I made him breakfast, because I thought I could have another story. We go out. He says I'm beautiful. The next morning, I make him breakfast. If I didn't say no, it's just a romance. I made him breakfast because if I could make him breakfast, eggs, bacon, golden brown toast, I could pretend that it never happened. Women do not make their breakfast, and I made breakfast. I tell people I don't like eggs. God, I feel so stupid. No one puts trigger warnings on breakfast. I cut my hair short. I don't want to be beautiful anymore. Look at me though. Look at my smirk, my swagger, my steel-toed Doc Martens. No one would believe that I didn't fight. I am confident and arrogant and unsympathetic. This doesn't happen to girls like me. Girls like me fight and bite, except when they don't. I'm not broken in a way that makes a good story. I am an unsympathetic protagonist. I am a bad character. I am a bad victim. I am a bad story. But nonfiction doesn't care for neat narrative structure. Here is the nonfiction story. I make my breakfast. I compartmentalize. I move on. Eventually, years later, I eat eggs again. I don't think until recently I realized that this phenomenon is common. The term of art is unacknowledged rape. The most recent meta-analysis on the subject looked at women who said they had not experienced sexual assault, but then went on to describe a situation which clearly met the legal definition, such as unwanted vaginal, oral, or anal intercourse due to force, or threatening to harm you or someone else close to you. Most women, it turns out, do not recognize their experience as rape until time has passed. Men seem to be even less likely to recognize when they are assaulted. Empirically, it appears that most of us start in a place of unacknowledged rape, and acknowledgement is a gradual process that develops over time. We have an image of what sexual assault looks like in our minds, a myth. It's with a stranger, someone stronger than us who uses force, or it's a drug slipped into our drinks. The more the story diverges from that, the less likely we seem to even believe it ourselves. What if we willingly took drugs or did want to do something sexual, just not that sexual thing? What if we eventually said yes after being worn down by perpetual begging and pleading? Or to gain a sense of agency once it became clear that it was going to happen, no matter what answer we gave? What if we've built a life with the person who did this to us? What if we love them? But it's important to remember that the rape myth is a myth. Our platonic ideal of this is so different from what most people experience that it actively harms us. We think of a rapist as a stranger, but in 90% of cases it's someone we know, a friend or family member or romantic partner. We think of a victim as straight when In reality, the epidemiological findings are that bisexual women have roughly 3 times greater risk of being raped than straight women or lesbians. We think of a victim as female, even though 14% of adult men will be raped. We think of a perpetrator as male. Even some legal definitions revolve specifically around a penis. But in reality, women do commit rape, and their victims can be male or female or non-binary. Extraordinarily damaging. We're letting a social myth take root that trans women should be considered threatening, even though trans people are at double or triple the risk of experiencing rape than cis people are. And depressingly enough, it seems that the more we believe in rape myths, the less likely we are to believe ourselves when we are raped. But I don't tell you all of this to convince you that we need to create a new and more accurate version of who is a rapist and who is a rape victim. Update the rape myth. Even if we had a good handle on the real likelihoods of any individual who will experience rape, we'd be committing the ecological fallacy if we thought that that meant that someone else wouldn't be. To be blunt, physically abled cis straight men sometimes are raped. And while people focusing on prevention will obviously gravitate towards those who are statistically at the most risk, the fact remains that those atypical victims will still need to grapple with what happened to them and how to proceed. You might be familiar with the anti-feminist response to labeling. It goes something like, maybe we're just unfairly reframing bad sex. We're not. That's all that response deserves. If we were, then those people who rejected the labels and did frame it as bad sex would fare better than those with match scenarios who label it as or SA. It matches the thought that myself and many of my friends have had. Maybe this will hurt less if we don't put a label on it. Maybe we would have been better off just going about our days, locking the bad experience away, not having to put a label on it, or more importantly, on ourselves. But this has also been studied, and it doesn't seem to be the case. People who don't acknowledge have greater levels of psychopathology and maladaptive coping skills and are more likely to continue engaging with the perpetrator, which puts them at greater risk of re-victimization. There aren't enough longitudinal studies on it, but preliminarily it seems that when factors like the violence of the assault are controlled for, those who acknowledge are able to facilitate recovery. But in some ways, we're not at recovery yet. We do like to rush to recovery. We think that's part of the problem. With all the strategies we use, bargaining, denial, depersonalization, minimization, strategies that we can use even during the event itself or right after. Instead, I want to sit here, naming the thing that happened, not telling ourselves it was just bad sex or a miscommunication. If you've experienced harm, it doesn't help you to pretend that you haven't. You can't ignore a broken leg and continue to use it as if it's not. That's part of the reason I keep saying the word victim. There's a rush, I think, to call ourselves survivors. And sure, use that term if you'd like, but I'm not a fan, at least not right afterwards. It feels like saying your leg has survived a break when you've had a doctor just fit the cast. We'll all be victims at different times. I don't think it's helpful to stigmatize ourselves or others by focusing more on optimistic and positive terms in the aftermath of something bad. It may be at our lowest points that we own these terms, victim. And while even most people who are raped, even those who developed psychopathological disorders do feel better, that rush to feel better is in many ways a strategy to minimize. I don't mean to tell you, though, that there is something magic in any of these words. I actually am not going to say that you should call something rape if it felt more like sexual assault, or that you need to call yourself a victim if you feel like a survivor, or whatever else you could interpret me as saying. And I'm certainly not saying that you need a word to encapsulate the way you've been hurt. So many of the ways we get hurt don't have an easy label or definition. Some of you might not conceptualize things verbally at all. So this appeal for you to name what happened to you is actually not me arguing that you need to condense what happened to one word, but it is an appeal for you to come out of denial if that's where you are. It's me saying that in as much as I can surmise, it is important to admit that something happened, even if just to yourself, and not to rush to justify or add caveats or convince yourself it was no big deal If you are hurt, it's a big deal. Name the harm as harm. I don't want to mine painful memories for YouTube. The emotional heaviness of writing this section is a large part of why this essay has taken us so long to make. But I also just can't defer to published literature dispassionately. I tried. I've written and thrown away a lot of drafts of this section, and any other way of engaging felt too much like lying, or like I was telling people not to be ashamed of a thing that happened to them, a thing that wasn't their fault. Well, I wasn't willing to do the same. But all that said, I am still a prison abolitionist, and being a rape victim is a large part of why. The gotcha people think they have by talking about rapists isn't a gotcha at all. Dealing with rapists is the most commonly asked question in the abolitionist literature. And me, selfishly, when I think about why I wouldn't report, the answer is less to do with my morals and more to do with pragmatics. Rapists don't just impact survivors, they impact juries and judges and lawyers who can use arguments like, his penis was too small for rape to have occurred, or the victim orgasmed, or even, still, a doctor's perception of whether the woman in question has a hymen. Seriously, this is from a paper published in the US in 2006, saying that sometimes we still do virginity testing. As a teenager, I went to the police station to support my friend as she reported her rape, and even though her case ended with the perpetrator doing jail time, nothing could convince me more that I wouldn't ever report than watching a middle-aged cop roll his eyes at my sobbing friend and ask if she was really sure she wasn't just trying to cover up having willingly done something slutty. But I also frankly did not want either of the people who raped me to be jailed. And apparently that's common. A large barrier for many people in labeling their experience as rape is not wanting to consider the implications of putting someone we care about into a place like prison. In my case, that's not me expressing forgiveness or wanting the best for either of them. It is me knowing that deep down, seeing them punished in that way, I wouldn't do anything to alleviate my hurt. But hey, I don't think the guy on Twitter really wants to engage with me as a survivor speaking about my experiences. The people who are willing to invoke victimization without doing the most basic Google of the literature aren't really interested in rape victims as anything other than pawns. But here I am, naming the thing. Telling you all that naming the thing is also important. To let go of self-blame. To have a name for the hurt you're feeling. To keep from letting denial put you in situations which could lead to you experiencing more harm. To give yourself permission to be a mess.
Okay, back to discussing the perspective of when you've done harm, but now you've made the first step and you're trying to change. And you know what, before we get into that section, I just want to acknowledge that this essay is being filmed on unceded Tory grounds, conquered by the once proud ruling class of Britain, and really by rights, all this beautiful Irish countryside belongs to King Charles Gotha Saxburg of the Sausage Fingers and the Empire of Cake. And I just want to acknowledge that with an acknowledgement, and then we can just move on and completely forget I said anything. I should be careful making fun of ancestral acknowledgements, and I should be clear, it is not my issue to make fun of. Across Indigenous communities, it seems feelings are mixed about land acknowledgements. There are those who see them as meaningless or borderline offensive, and then there are those that see them as useful, if only as a first step to more meaningful action, or getting people to face the truth of their history.
You are here, young, strong Indigenous leaders,
But thinking of land acknowledgements as an end unto themselves, that they are the emancipation, that is a convenient illusion only for white people. Looking at land acknowledgements that way is for genocide apologists like Justin Trudeau and so on.
We have been waiting for this moment.
Because owning the harm is not enough, right? It's not enough to just be like, oh, you caught me, I did the racism. Aren't I very good for acknowledging it? Like land acknowledgements, at best, owning the harm is a starting point. And unless it is a starting point followed by more meaningful change, restitution, accountability, and the doing of good, then, like land acknowledgements, owning the harm is pretty meaningless. So let's actually start to go through the next set of steps, carefully, meaningfully. If we are part of the problem, if we have done harm, let's really look at best practice for how to make it better, and demand of ourselves to start to change. But hang on, you say, why? Why dedicate so much energy to helping the wrongdoer? the person who's done harm, the racist, the misogynist. With everything gone to shit in the world and all of the systemic violence and apocalyptic dread, why take abusers and wrongdoers and toxic people by the hand and do a navel-gazing self-improvement leftist cook's weekend retreat with them? Why encourage them in being, as Foucault put it, the therapeutic self? Well, okay, fair. So you know the joke, men will literally do X instead of go to therapy, like men will literally dox a queer celebrity instead of go to therapy, or men will literally commit a genocide instead of going to therapy, and so on. Well, that's not a million miles away from the truth. Systemic abuse is manifested by individual action, and the power that individuals have over one another to do harm and get away with it is made possible by systems made of people. The furthest that the old "men would rather" joke gets from the truth is when it implies that only men avoid change in favor of perpetuating harm, and when it implies that going to therapy is the singular path to change, as if therapy were a monolith and that everyone who pays for it gets results. Unfortunately, we all can and do perpetuate harm, and we all can interpret any form of self-improvement to change as little as possible. No therapist in the world is good enough to help you if you're not being honest. They can only work with the information you give them, and some of them won't even do that. There's even some data to show that in group therapy sessions, where the majority of the group have misogynistic attitudes towards women, the outcomes can actually be worse for perpetrators of intimate partner violence. They can come away with greater justifications for their actions. Okay then, you say, and don't think I can't hear you interrupting me again. Seriously, why take people like that by the hand? That seems hopelessly messy, and like the path to change only exists for people capable of helping themselves. The ones who embed themselves in toxicity can't be helped. Fuck them! It's like that George Carlin joke. There's no such thing as self-help.
If you did it yourself, you didn't need help.
But the thing is, Sarah and I have been seeing a relationship therapist. We've needed that. We've been through some stuff, and we go through some stuff still. Harm is often the thing you do when you are really trying to do something else. And despite the advice of our very sound and sage relationship therapist, I have been really struggling with, for example, just practicing mindfulness for 5 minutes a day. Like, really struggling. Really resistant. And I think that my resistance is quite irrational. I think it manifests from my thinking of myself as not needing help, and my conceiving of the practice of taking care of myself as boring and beneath me. And even though I can't help but conceive of others as good and bad, as those who would help themselves to improve and ultimately try to be good people, and those who will only ever bed themselves down in stubbornly regressive views and self-righteousness, still, when it comes to the actual literal business of doing my 5 minutes of mindfulness a day, I struggle to do it. So what's the difference between me and those people? Who am I to separate myself from the bad people? Let's just presume some level of mutual failure in attempting and doing potential harm and doing potential good amongst all of us silly mortals, shall we? Within the complex knot of systemic and self-deception is a wealth of empirical data on what actually does help people to change, to make amends, to help those that they have harmed, and ultimately to make the world a better place. Even when dealing with the dark stuff. Because it's systematic no matter what. It should be chunked down no matter what. It gets to be an impossibly boring and off-putting procedure of doing something that is beneath you and cringe and banal, and yet somehow you have to do it, or terrible things will continue to happen no matter what. So even with something that involves quite severe and long-term harmful behavior like intimate partner violence, we can still identify effective interventions and glean from that some insight into what sort of situations are fertile grounds for these terrible behaviors, what sort of interventions and situations help to prevent IPV. Because yes, intimate partner violence, it's one of the worst things people do to one another. But in understanding how it functions, we can see patterns, and if patterns can be identified, then patterns can be disrupted. Sadly, IPV is also a very understudied area. From the limited data we have, we can say that therapy for perpetrators has outcomes. And yes, broadly, roughly, therapy reduces intimate partner violence, but this should be taken with several large, spicy grains of salt. For example, in a systematic review of 13 studies, no therapeutic type on its own was particularly the most helpful in reducing IPV. There doesn't seem to be a silver bullet cure form of therapy. Plus, the heterogeneity was so high in the meta-analysis in that systematic review that Sarah was like, I don't know that they even should have published that part. I do love her. There's not enough evidence, for example, to show that CBT is impactful on perpetrators of IPV. But therapies that address substance use and trauma disorders did have significantly better results. And I think there's something to that. In trying to understand why people engage in these kinds of behaviors, or indeed Bringing that parallel back to yourself in a general process of trying to change, identifying the underlying issues like substance use can lead to better results. In a paper from Iceland looking at narratives in therapy, they found that men who had committed intimate partner violence and underwent therapy generally adopted the language of therapeutic practice when talking about themselves and what they had done, but that they did so in both positive and negative ways. Some participants actually used therapeutic language to excuse their behaviors and blame them on external factors. That paper recommended that service providers
take a holistic approach, not only by focusing on psychological causes and individual characteristics, but also to incorporate structural factors such as the workings of gender relations and patriarchy.
At which point the joke is, men will literally go to therapy rather than go to therapy. Because the environment that produces people is the issue here. The environment that produces men, the environment that produces violence. The environmental factors are huge in determining the causes of IPV. And also, content warning for sexual violence, we're about to go back across the Rubicon. So we've made a sub-chapter within this chapter, so you can skip that if you're going to be triggered by discussions of SA. Because yes, environmental factors are huge in determining the causes also of rape and sexual violence. And for those of you who aren't skipping to the next bit, I'm asking you gently to go with me in applying the principles of what's an extremely horrible act like SA to the more general process of self-development and starting to change when you've done a harmful thing of some other description. I promise you this comparison is not glib. It's a reality because patriarchy and rape culture, much like white supremacy or heteronormativity, are environments that surround us and inform our views of the world and ourselves. We don't know where they end and we start. And in much the same way that it is unhelpful to hold on to that idea of I am a good person, I am, or I don't need to do fucking mindfulness, yuck. It is also unhelpful to hold on to the idea that you are somehow special and impenetrable in terms of patriarchy, no matter your gender, no matter your peers. Now, having said all of that, unsurprisingly, the link between SA and having truly patriarchal worldviews is undeniable. In a study of campus sexual assault, a significant correlation was found between engaging in sexually coercive conduct and endorsing views supporting sexual dominance and hostility towards women.
Masculine identity formation in adolescence often involves treating sex as a game or competition. Young men with little sexual experience who are highly motivated to have sex with many women may have a particularly difficult time recognizing the line between seduction and coercion.
Male sexual assaulters are also more likely to believe that their peers also hold hostile attitudes towards women. And they are more likely to have peers who pressure them to be sexually active. In this context, people who work for the Daily Wire and shite on about the decline of the West are actively turning men into rapists. Having said all of that, framing sexual assault and sexually coercive behavior as the domain of the bad men doesn't really bear out in the research either. Most people who commit sexual assault only do so once when they're young, but it is common. And it is rampant. And again, the data on this isn't comprehensive because it's a famously underreported experience. That makes sense in the context of Sarah's previous section, and it'll make sense to anyone who's ever tried to report sexual assault. The system under which sexual violence happens, from campus to police station to courthouse, is patriarchy all the way down. The gray area, sexually coercive and sexually violent behavior, however damaging and traumatizing it is, remains possible for a lot of people to perform without real consequence. In a way, the role of patriarchy here is much like the normative whiteness that goes unaddressed until somebody points out racist behavior. Misogynistic attitudes from thought to word to action remain pretty normative in various social situations. And the identity of dude bro who hurts women has low salience, goes unnoticed until it doesn't. However, that pattern of hostile attitudes towards women, being motivated by sexual conquest as a game to win, of being inexperienced sexually, of having peers who share your hostility towards women, who condone or even encourage your behavior, and of course, the exacerbating factors of alcohol or substance use, all can be disrupted at each point. What determines whether a man who commits sexual assault will do it a second time?
What determines whether a man who commits sexual assault will do it a second time? Antonia Abbey and Pam McAuslin found that non-repeaters had significantly less hostile attitudes towards women than did repeat assaulters, were less likely to misperceive women's sexual intentions, engaged in less delinquent behavior, and were less likely to drink prior to consensual sex. Non-repeaters were also more likely to have expressed remorse over their past sexual assaults and were less likely to hold the women responsible for the assaults than were repeaters.
In applying this schema of potential pattern disruption to yourself, you can disrupt some of the assumptions you might have about what starting to change looks like. Changing your relationship to your environment, the power structure, patriarchy, white supremacy, transphobia, and so on, your relationship to your peers, and your relationship to alcohol and substances all seems to have, if not a more significant role, then an equally significant role than any amount of therapy. But again, you can be systematic within that systematic schema. You can be honest about what genuinely impacts you and motivates you to change, and you can be honest about how honest you actually are. As I said, group therapy sessions where the group is a bunch of sexist lads seems to be actively counterproductive. As I said, I am personally resistant to doing the fucking mindfulness exercises, even though I know I should. And this is why it's smart to fence off reliably effective disruptions in neutral, external things. That's what that is. It's just putting it outside of you so that you fucking actually do it. Because these interventions can be pretty subtle and arbitrary. And oh look, it's the people who skipped ahead. Hello! Just in time to talk about filling in workbooks. What a top-notch video essay. It's gonna be us and vaccines and measured response and break bread. Top 3 essays of all time. Sorry, workbooks. Okay, but we are going to talk about workbooks because interventions are arbitrary and boring. I'm sorry. Whether it's speaking to someone who just asks you questions about yourself, or it's completing little journal entries every day, or it's practicing tapping yourself on this shoulder and then this shoulder, long term, doing things differently means you feel differently. And yeah, you can absolutely be the person that a particular intervention doesn't work for. You can be a person on the complete wrong path with loads of conventional forms of therapy, and it can happen over and over again that it just doesn't work for you because of some complexity with your issues or just bad luck. But please don't apply the ecological fallacy to yourself. If you're the outlier, but the data still says that on the whole it's good advice for most people, like most people in a video essay's viewership, then it's still good advice. And I do this sometimes too, so I get it, but please don't rationalize inaction or hopelessness for everyone just because that's the logical extension of your own resistance to helping yourself. You see it there, yet another reason why an external intervention, where what you do is up to some standardized systematic set of steps, can be so helpful. Because it doesn't matter what you guess its efficacy would be. Take something as simple as the workbook Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. We'll put a link in the description, which is a 28-day challenge, a workbook now, to combat racism, internalize unacknowledged white supremacist thoughts, and change the world. As Saad puts it, become a good ancestor. You can purchase that workbook and just complete little daily exercises, kind of like keeping up on your Duolingo or whatever. And because this is an intervention for unexamined biases you're not really fully aware of, the act of considering them makes them examined biases. And in the long term, like with emotional regulation practices or sleep hygiene practices or just physical exercise, or yes, little mental exercises to challenge your own conception of race, eventually in the long term, you start to notice a difference. You start to notice change. And it's boring, and it's not dramatic or cathartic or even particularly inspirational. It's not the magic symbolism of land acknowledgements according to Justin Trudeau, and it's not the sort of thing that will get us into the top 3 video essays of all time. But if you do your little exercises, I'll do mine. How's that sound?
So I have insomnia, and here's what I mean by that. You know how babies start to develop their day-night circadian rhythm around 4 months of age? Yeah, well I didn't. Like, my parents alternated staying up with me because, baby, I was up all night long. I had a nanny who I loved dearly, and she apparently got very good at holding me still during big parts of the day when I'd fall asleep. My favorite TV shows were late-night talk shows. There's a story about my Aunt Pat and Uncle Joe babysitting me while my parents went out, and when they came back after midnight, they found all of us sitting on the front porch, both of my relatives asleep, while I sat chatting away, swinging my legs, chipper and wide awake.
You do chat a lot late at night, Sarah.
That's the cute side of it. It was a lot less cute when I was an adult and still just unable to sleep. All through high school, then college, then in my working life, just staring at the ceiling, physically tired, mentally tired, desperate to sleep, and not being able to. So when I started my graduate degree and the lecturer in my psychiatry class brought up sleep hygiene, I was offended. Sleep hygiene is simplistic and boring. It's telling someone, get up as soon as you wake up. Don't chill in bed. In fact, don't use your bed for anything other than sleeping. Set an alarm for the same time every single day and get up even if you're exhausted, even if you don't have to work that day. Don't try and catch up on sleep, and try and go to bed at the same time every night. And this was supposed to cure my lifelong insomnia. I was annoyed. I know that people use the term insomnia loosely. It's the same as migraines. People will say they have a migraine because they think it just means a bad headache and not a neurological condition. So I thought, maybe these strategies work for the sorts of people who miss a bit of sleep and call it insomnia, but they surely wouldn't work for me, the kind of person who has never figured out how one translates being sleepy into actually sleeping. But when I complained to my friend Beher, a medical doctor who was taking the class with me, he asked if I'd ever given it a proper try. Not just done it for a few nights and then abandoned it, but actually committed to doing it fully, being regimented about my bed and wake time for 6 weeks. And the truth is I hadn't. And so I did. And it worked. Like, it's embarrassing how much it worked. Having insomnia was a part of my life. It was a part of my identity. I never thought it could go away, but it did. Not overnight, not with a pill or hypnosis or a really good massage, but because for 6 weeks I didn't watch TV in bed. And I made myself wake up at the same time every day, even on weekends. Even now, years later, I'm like, really? The whole time that was it? I really love the implementation side of research, the part where you take a public health finding and translate research into messaging. Like, at some point, someone figured out that brushing your teeth twice a day for 2 minutes is enough to keep away most cavities and prevent lost teeth, which would have been a world-changing finding. Or thinking about the people who figured out that telling doctors to wash their hands before surgery significantly reduced infection. A lot of public health messages are, in fact, deceptively simple. But also, I've seen people react to those simple measures with the same indignity I had about my insomnia. I saw one going around Twitter. It was Twitter back then, back when you could make a joke about sharpening a guillotine for the billionaires without getting banned. Anyway, I have a newish account on the website X now, if you want to follow me. Back when it was Twitter, I remember some people I admire getting indignant about the idea that roughly 15 minutes a day of moderate exercise, like walking, would help with depression, saying that clearly it indicates how unseriously we take depression as an illness. But the thing is, I've seen those papers. Here, I'll put some in our works cited so you can read them too if you want. It's not magic, but it's really effective. Of course, not everyone will be able to do it. Of course, motivation is a barrier with depression. Of course, there are individual cases where it just doesn't work. But just because it's a deceptively simple intervention doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It's like that scene from BoJack Horseman.
Oh God. Oh God. Oh, I hate this. Oh God. It gets easier, huh? Every day it gets a little easier. Yeah, but you gotta do it every day. That's the hard part. But it does get easier. Okay.
I watched that whole series. I wonder how different it would have been if he just kept running every day. We're not talking about perpetrators anymore. We're talking about victims, about you. You've been hurt, you've been victimized. You've recognized that you've been victimized and named the hurt as best you can. So what happens now? Well, that depends on how you feel. Pain in some capacity, maybe shock, maybe anger. You might want to scream, throw things, burn everything down. I kind of think you should be allowed to do some of that within reason. We should have a world where the people who have been hurt are believed and centered and given scope and leeway to feel their emotions. I will fight for that world, for myself and for you, for my friends, for my stepkids. Imagining people who've been betrayed and wanting to wrap everyone up in blankets and kiss their heads and tell them to scream because being hurt isn't okay. And telling them they have to do anything past that feels like putting salt into a wound. But there is no way for me to say this except directly. At some point, as unfair as it is, you may have to take on the work of starting to heal. So let me tell you what I mean by healing and what it looks like. It doesn't look like denial. It doesn't look like pretending it didn't happen. It also doesn't look like returning to a norm, pretending that it didn't impact you. If you've been harmed, then you will be impacted. Your sense of self, safety, or judgment may all feel transformed by having been hurt. Just like naming what happened is the first step in processing your victimization, this second step, starting to heal, It requires that you recognize that you've been hurt and that the hurt will mean that you cannot go back exactly to things as they were before. Being harmed changes you and your orientation to the world. It's a part of the nature of victimization. You're not going to go back to before, but you are going to find a new normal. And it isn't fair. It's not fair that you're in this position. It's not fair that you're going to have to now work in order to feel better. It's not fair. But the unfairness shouldn't stop you from cautiously and deliberately building back a new normal, because you do deserve to heal. Look, self-love is hard. Personally, I find it cringy and eye-rolly as a topic, and I know that self-love for me is even harder when something bad has happened to me. In that case, the last thing I want to do is get out of bed every day. I want to lay in bed, fuck up my sleep hygiene, and pirate old episodes of BoJack Horseman so that I distract myself by leaning into really feeling that everything is sad and hopeless and fucked. But when I do that, my insomnia comes back. And when I don't take a walk, my mood is impacted. And there's no pain large enough that it can't be chipped away at, even if all of the interventions, journaling, exercising, seeing friends, all seem so insignificant. But healing takes time. Slow, small steps will take you from the place where you're in pain to the place where you feel better and better, until you will be there at that new normal. One caveat though, because without mentioning this, I feel like I'll be setting you up to fail. Because I'm speaking to someone who has been victimized, it's more likely that you are in a disempowered position. And that disempowerment probably extends past the individual person who hurt you. And that means you should be discerning about the people you seek out for help. Under patriarchy, some people will blame a victim of IPV. Under white supremacy, a psychologist may see disordered anxiety where they should be seeing racial victimization. Not to mention the endless group of grifters who exist just to victimize people who are hurting and desperate, from individual psychic mediums to big groups like the Landmark Forum. I can't warn you about all of the grifters, but often they have a tell, and that's that their claims will be big, and their promises will talk about recovery that's speedy. Sleep with this amulet, complete this 7-day intensive, write "I love myself" on a paper 333 times, and now you will be better. It's rather the opposite of the public health measures, which often rely on small changes applied consistently. So, in your rush to feel better, do be discerning about the ways you seek support, because you are vulnerable, and that makes you an easy target. But still have faith. We've all been through painful situations, and they pass. While you wait, though, reach out to a friend that gives good advice. Eat food that makes you feel nourished. Go for a walk every day, and please, try to get some sleep. The concept of dual power was first introduced by Vladimir Lenin in an essay of the same name, where he outlined how one government could be overthrown through establishing another in parallel. The concept has expanded since then, and we're going to define it rather informally as any sort of system put into place by an unsanctioned group with the aim of competing alongside or eventually replacing the sanctioned group. Or, more succinctly, community replacing institution. I am not a political theorist, and I need to read a lot more, but at this moment, dual power is, in my mind, one of the most compelling strategies for divesting from current oppressive systems and moving, instead, towards more liberatory ones, as Frederick Jameson summarizes in his explanation.
In such situations, power moves to the networks to which people turn for practical help and leadership on a daily basis. In effect, they become an alternate government without officially challenging the ostensibly legal structure. The point at which a confrontation and a transfer take place, at which the official government begins to wither away, a point at which revolutionary violence appears, will of course vary within the overall political and cultural context itself.
Think of Fred Hampton giving children free breakfast. The state may have decided that feeding hungry children is not a service it should provide, but the Panthers did it anyway. So let's get back to our issue. You've hurt someone, you've owned the harm, you've started to change. The next step then is restitution, accountability, consequences. Facing up not just to what you've done internally, but now facing your victim and making amends. If you're in the US or UK or here in Ireland, the system for doing this is carceral. Cops, reports, court statements, barristers, a jury of your peers, whatever the unique configuration of factors in your case, it will all lead to someone with a wig and a gavel telling you what your official punishment will be. Depending on what you've done, or more realistically, whether you can afford decent legal counsel, you may have to go to prison. You may lose your freedom altogether. Hell, in the US, where the death penalty is legal, you may in fact lose your life. And too often, Once the system gets its wheels rolling, they'll keep going regardless of the impact on the victim. This is, to me, the heart of why I do not like our current carceral justice system. A hurt or crime is itself a deeply individual thing. Carceral systems make us all fit specific infractions into specific categories and spit out punishments which really only differ in terms of time. You did a bad drugs crime, you should be in prison for 5 years. You did an SA crime, you should be in prison for 3 months, etc. And I use that example knowingly because part of the reason carceral systems are so inhuman and evil is that they replicate and reinforce the same existing biases we're always banging on about, and so yes, vulnerable people are punished more often and more harshly. The most marginalized people serve the most time for the least damaging crimes. Crimes which are determined by that same system. Owners of capital who have chosen to criminalize shoplifting but not wage theft, who categorize substances as worse based on whether those substances are commonly used by the wealthy or the poor, who patrol black and brown neighborhoods, using the system not as a way to alleviate pain for victims, but instead to threaten and dominate those who are already disenfranchised. But I know our audience. I'm going to assume you're caught up on the idea that prisons are bad. Plus, FD Signifier released a video essay called Fuck the Police, and because it is recent and thorough, I'd recommend watching that. Anything else I'd say on the subject would just be repetition. So I propose an alternative, or well, I don't propose it. There's nothing new about reparative justice, the goals of which are
repairing the damage done by the offender, getting the victim involved, reconciliation between the victim and the offender, creating an alternative to imprisonment and current criminal justice sanctions, and making society at large more humane.
As much as a carceral system of punishment is currently normalized, reparative justice systems were probably the norm through most of our history.
Small, interdependent, and economically cooperative communities could not afford to kill, expel, or in any other form, render unproductive those who caused trouble, because every member was valuable and often needed to guarantee the clan's survival. Furthermore, the community had to find a way to absorb that person back into the community quickly and harmoniously. Thus, ritual satisfaction and restitution became the favored forms of resolving criminal behavior in acephalous societies.
Reparative justice is, by its nature, meant to be tailored to the situation at hand, but broadly, the main goals are 1. To explain to the perpetrator the consequences of their actions on the victim, 2. To facilitate the perpetrator in making reparations, and 3. When it's mutually beneficial, to reconcile the perpetrator with their victim and with the broader community. And the reason that I brought up and possibly misused dual power at the start of this is that within our communities, we can use reparative systems to deal with harm, whether or not that harm meets a codified definition of crime. We could, if we so choose, spare the victim the trauma of appearing in court and actually try and repair things for them. So if you've hurt someone, this is a process you could suggest. Now look, this doesn't mean I'm going to advocate that we all need to accept a ritual apology and playing nice. If you've harmed someone, they are under no obligation to go through a reparative process with you. However, the data seems to indicate that those who choose to have better outcomes. Victim satisfaction is higher after undergoing a reparative process rather than a court process. And honestly, to me, it just makes sense. I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in sin. The things we conceptualize as wrongs are so because they have caused harm to someone. So shouldn't it follow that the person be centered in whatever reparative process follows? Of course, as with all stages, this might be intimidating. Sure, you've worked on some of your shit, you've started to change, but this is the step where you might have to sit across from a person you've hurt and hear just how badly you've hurt them. You might have to face the depths of what you're capable of. And you will have to face consequences. Because even if we're avoiding the sort of one-size-fits-all punishment for punishment's sake, there are always consequences. Maybe you'll have to part with some of your money or your time. Maybe you'll have to resign from a job or give up a platform. Maybe your victim will say they do not want to speak to you again. Maybe members of your community will say that the best thing you can do to make it up to them is to leave them alone. In some ways, this can be more work than a carceral system. Your crime isn't wiped clean after a certain amount of time has passed. But to really take accountability, you can't avoid consequences. The aim of this process is not to figure out a way for you, the perpetrator, to return to the status quo. Likewise, the aim is not vengeance. Instead, it is acknowledging that the status quo has been permanently changed for the victim, and you are committing to trying to make any possible amends, as well as committing to not re-victimize them or others in future. But as always, the system only works if you, the perpetrator, are willing to engage with it for real. When someone is seeking accountability through a community process rather than a formal system, a big part of that accountability will be in adhering to self-imposed consequences, even if you aren't institutionally held responsible. You could at any time just stop. At least right now. Maybe in the future we'll have more established communities with agreed upon norms around justice and what we do when someone breaks them. You know, a real social contract that we've actually consensually agreed to, not just been told we tacitly agreed to by being born. But at this point, when so many of us have weak communities to begin with, it can be very easy to drop out of a justice process. You could even find justification in doing so. The moderator didn't respond to your last message. You're getting annoyed at how much time has passed. Your psychological immune system may be tempting you with the sorts of minimizing or distracting thoughts telling you it's okay to quit. It was only a cake. All I can say is that reparative justice has higher satisfaction for the perpetrator too, and lower recidivism. And if you really do care about being a good person, which you're spending your Tuesday watching this, of course you do, then the best way to deal with the harm you've caused is to face it. Listen to your victim and deal with the consequences. And after all of that, maybe you can apologize.
In February of this year, an actor and drag queen from Derry in Northern Ireland named Joseph James tweeted, they were called tweets back then, a public apology to famous adult human birthing person Joanne Kitchenette Rowling. The apology was in relation to a now deleted tweet in which Joseph claimed that Nazis supported Joanne in her gender-critical views. It might be more accurate, however, for me to say that the apology was as a result of this tweet.
Okie dokie, JJ. We'll have it your way. Give my regards to your solicitors.
So the apology was made. Joseph's language was functional and neutral. I would like to publicly apologise for a previous Twitter thread where I interacted with J.K. Rowling on matters relating to the transgender community. It's perfectly reasonable. You could say watertight. I have now removed these tweets and would like to apologise to J.K. Rowling directly for causing potential upset. And if you came across this thread, you might see it as just another official sounding social media apology. I failed to choose my words with care and would like to retract my previous statements relating to her views on the LGBTQ+, and more specifically, transgender people. But if you're familiar with more of the context, then this apology might imply some coercion, maybe an absence of sincerity, maybe even, if you want to see it, passive aggression. I would also like to retract my likening to J.K. Rowling to any far-right or Nazi organisation and emphasise I do not wish any individual, inclusive of J.K. Rowling, to come to any harm. I mean, the guy is from Derry. People from Derry do have a certain mastery of the ostensibly sincere clapback.
You know, every year I sit backstage listening to the singers and it really makes me realise just how talented the professionals who originally recorded these tracks were.
As an online community, we're familiar with forced apologies, apologies that exist essentially to avoid litigation, and particularly as online queer people or lavender surfers, we're familiar with the kinds of apologies that we have to give to keep our platform, to keep from financial devastation in the courts. And while such apologies are usually reliable signs of a commitment to future caution on the subject, these kinds of public statements don't really speak to regret the emotion, or to any change of heart, or anything internal whatsoever. When understood in their context, just like the couple of apologies from the BBC to J.K. Rowling, we can interpret them more as commitments to how the discourse will be interacted with in future. They signify alignment within social structures, and any admission of error is less an expression of wrongdoing and more an admission of thinking you had more freedom to speak than you actually did. The term of art that sometimes gets used is an instrumental apology. An apology made for the purpose of avoiding punishment, rejection by peers, or litigation. This is contrasted with a sincere apology, which sounds like it's pretty self-explanatory and simple, and those are the terms we're going to use as we explore apologizing and making amends in a postmodern world, whilst this all becomes increasingly not simple. Because that issue of this being a postmodern world reveals increasingly complex and recursive layers of problematic for the moral actor, that's you, acting with moral agency, which do you think you can? For an academic, for example, setting out to study the differences between instrumental and sincere apologies, there is, in my view, an arbitrary drawing of a line. Everything on this side of the line contains motivations that are instrumental, that is, self-preserving, socially structural, economic in some sense, under capitalism, and everything on the other side of the line is altruistic or derived from empathy and either a deontological right and wrong binary or a utilitarian do the most good, do the least harm motivation. But where the fuck do we draw this line? One of the contemporary philosophers who is most deeply mired in these issues is a guy called Frederick Jameson. He's a Marxist, sort of and a philosopher and media critic. His sometimes impenetrable work dedicates a tremendous amount of thought to the idea that meaning itself is eroded under the current capitalist project. We find such a line hard to draw because our motivations under capitalism and the signification of those motivations are all a bloody horrible mess. Following on from post-structuralists like Foucault, and specifically here Baudrillard, Jameson refers to empty signifiers.
Jean Baudrillard has indeed gone so far as to assert that language in this shares the transformation of the older capitalism into something in which the classical referent, value in the case of commodities, meaning or the signified in the case of signs, is rapidly disappearing, creating a dizzying and uninterruptible circulation in the void, both of media commodities and of those empty signifiers. I would myself have preferred to stress the fragmentation of the publics, following upon the atomization and monetization of contemporary society, and the increasing uncertainty as to whether your own local code will be meaningful down the hall, let alone across the border.
But what does that mean? What is an empty signifier exactly? Well, the video essayist Jonas Sika. His channel used to be called Cuck Philosophy. Yes, now it's CCK Philosophy, or just Jonas Sika.
Maybe he realized that cuck is a really bad word to have in your internet handle. It's almost as bad as the word liberal.
Yes, well, I'm very sorry about that, Sarah. I'm deeply, deeply sorry. Now we need to get back to the empty signifiers of apology. A fantastic analysis of this idea in his video about The Simpsons and the death of parody. Homer Simpson used to be a parody of the patriarch in American sitcoms. From Bill Cosby to Bob Saget, the man at the head of the household in the golden age of the sitcom was hardworking, charming, loving, firm but fair, and happy. Homer was none of those things, but like everything else in The Simpsons, he could not and should not be read outside of the context of television and culture, outside of functioning as a reference. However, as Homer the product, the cultural icon, began to overshadow everything that he was satirizing, becoming a reference point more so than a meaningful symbol, then his meaning, the substance of what he signified, was eroded. Until Homer Simpson didn't really mean anything anymore.
And it could be argued that this is what most Simpsons characters came to be after the show's decline. Empty signs, with no internal content of their own. Thus, any product can have the Simpsons name slapped on it, without communicating thereby any particular meaning.
So that's empty signification, and I'm wondering if accountability itself is either an empty signifier, or if it is composed of a collection of empty signifiers. Some examples might be, "It is with deep regret that I," or "If you have been impacted by my actions," or "I wish for nothing but the best for the victim," or "I hope that these words bring you some closure." Although the situation is complicated and there are many things I could say in my defense. So we recognize the tune, and while it's admittedly not straightforward enough to label all of that as insincerity, to label it as always instrumental, it is still arguable that the closer accountability is to prefabricated and cliched, the less cathartic it is in terms of receiving the inner world of another human being. It's not a new trick to look at sincerity and authenticity, to look at human closeness through the lens of postmodern commodification and alienation. Returning to our example of the exchange between J.K. Rowling and Joseph James, you can see that the references within those cliches of apology aren't so abstracted that they are meaningless, rather they're making new references on additional layers of meaning. But they can't do both, you see. It can't be sincere and insincere. That exchange wasn't meta-modern comedy writing for children and adults to enjoy together on different levels, like The Muppets or Bluey. It was straightforward, postmodern, passive-aggressive warfare, where the insincerity of the words, "I apologize," is fully apparent to all relevant parties. And so, as I said, this is not simple. But that is also not an excuse. Let's look at a different example of a very public apology, which the victim referred to as a masterclass on how to apologize. In January 2018, writer and showrunner Dan Harmon apologized to fellow writer and his employee Megan Gantz for sexual harassment in the writer's room of the show Community. He made his apology on an episode of his podcast Harmontown, and listening to it, I can see why so many people hold this apology up as an exercise in doing it right.
I want you to be the one to examine this and every step of the way decide for yourself where I'm making mistakes. I don't want to explain to you what I've learned. I want you to look at this, and I want it to sound relatively unremarkable to you, because that's the danger. I broke up with my girlfriend, then I went right, full steam into creeping on my employee. Now it was even less appropriate after all. Now I wasn't in danger of being a bad person. And then after that season, I got overt about my feelings after it was wrapped, because now, and said, "Oh, I love you," and she said the same thing she'd been saying the entire time, in one language or another. Please, don't you understand that focusing on me like this, liking me like this, preferring me like this, I can't say no to it, and when you do it, it makes me unable to know whether I'm good at my job. And because I finally got to the point where I said to her, "Oh, this is, I love you," because that's what I thought it was when you target somebody for 2 years. And it was therefore rejected that way. I was humiliated. And so I continued to do the cowardly thing and continued to do the selfish thing. Now I wanted to teach her a lesson. I wanted to show her that if she didn't like being liked in that way, then, oh boy, she should get over herself. After all, if you're just going to be a writer, then this is how just writers get treated. And that was probably the darkest of it all. I'm going to assume that when she tweets about it, and refers to trauma, that's probably it, because I drank, I took pills, I crushed on her and resented her for not reciprocating it. And the entire time I was the one writing her paychecks and in control of whether she stayed or went, and whether she felt good about herself or not, and said horrible things. Just treated her cruelly, pointedly. Things that I would never, ever, ever have done if she had been male. And if I had never had those feelings for her.
In this essay, we're far from the first to analyze the shortcomings of the modern cliched apology. This is so true that, frankly, criticisms of apologies come with their own cliches. Namely, you do realize that in all of that, you didn't once say the words, "I'm sorry," which you can say of large swaths of Harmon's apology. Unfortunately, when analyzing apologies, it's all too easy to outline the marks that were not hit, when things like sincerity, transformation, and commitment to change are so much more subjective and elusive. I think, subjectively, in Harmon's case, he was right to worry less about making sure he said, "I'm sorry" a bunch of times. He was right to lean away from his own internal world of remorse and more towards the role he was playing in society. How he was positioned to hold power over a female employee, how what he was doing was representative of greater social inequities. Being Dan Harmon, the poster child for metatextuality, his apology is a deconstruction of apologies. His owning of workplace sexual harassment is a deconstruction of workplace sexual harassment. He's less worried about being the main character than he is worried about being a main character who hasn't learned anything, who hasn't accomplished any kind of transformation. He's most worried about continuing to lie to himself. As he identifies it, it was in lying to himself that he perpetuated and became a foot soldier for a comfortable world of systemic abuse. If we're to trust Harmon, or maybe it's better to trust Gantz in her response, then what makes this apology stand out is less the precision of the wording or the hitting of marks, and more the imperfect scrabbling at transformation. What we might hope to interpret from this apology is a commitment from Harmon to demand better of himself, to foster future workplaces that aren't sexist, that aren't breeding grounds for abuse. Unfortunately, in reality, this apology was followed by several seasons of Rick and Morty, in which Harmon's collaborator Justin Roiland was a monstrous, abusive, sexist fucking pig. Apparently terrible things happened in that workplace. And also, Harmon's legal team and management advised him not to make the apology. There were potentially huge negative repercussions for him and for his legal team and management, including the end of his career. Do you see what's going on here? That even personal integrity, when we find it, is immediately assaulted and eroded by our environment. Rejecting that system, rejecting the easy answers and easy advice, rejecting misogynist peers, rejecting the environment around you, rejecting your own habituation, be that your substance use or your comfortable position, all of that is what accountability could look like if it were effective. There will always be a job of work in unmaking systems of abuse. Dan Harmon made it clear that he likely would not have even thought of it as abuse if Megan Gantz hadn't made him. But she did, and this time the man listened. And this time, the man apologized publicly with real accountability, and he didn't lose his career. And when his workplace became toxic again, despite having built a media empire with his collaborator, he did oust Justin Roiland eventually. Small progress, you know? Frustrating, but that's just it. To me, a good faith attempt at real transformation and reinvention, real change, should far outweigh any focus on wording or perception. Small, meaningful progress that is dissatisfying and not cathartic, but real, is more important than the great grand gestures of insincere tears, self-immolation, or fucking sarcastic ukuleles. In the studies I referenced earlier, the ones that tried to establish the substantive differences between instrumental apologies and sincere apologies, the most striking differences were, 1, between apologies that were public-facing and apologies that were more private, and 2, the differences between those people who display high self-monitoring behaviors and low self-monitoring behaviors. In studying non-verbal behaviors when apologizing, one study found that expressions of sadness tend to be more present in instrumental apologies and, unsurprisingly, tend to be more exaggerated in those who display high self-monitoring. I'm sorry, and I look sorry, and I'm sad, and I'm remorseful, and my eyebrows are pursed together like two caterpillars trying to kiss, and so on, is all closer to indication of falseness than it is to indication of sincerity. But to me, the conclusion to come away with is that it doesn't really usefully indicate anything. What I took away from that is that in a postmodern world where we're all raised by television and the internet, and we take for granted the deconstruction of institutions and grand narratives, and we're surrounded by a complex network of false accountability and three-dimensional chess of litigation, in that world, performing accountability is complex to the point of absurdity. That's what I take away. If you take the authenticity as highest value perspective, that is, you're really trying to be sincere and do the right thing, then, in my opinion, you can only concern yourself with transformation. And then you should disregard the experience of authenticity because it's a solipsistic framework. It's too concerned with your perception of yourself. And that means that what you actually do is all just boring hard work and sacrificial things like, but not limited to, going to therapy and getting help, being held accountable by external forces, like being honest with that therapist and or those voices of external accountability, deconstruction of the systems that surround you because you literally don't know where they end and you start. Like your privilege is your comfort and your comfort is the facilitation of your behavior. So you have to be prepared to be uncomfortable or you're not being accountable. Being extraordinarily careful not to frame yourself as a victim in all of this, and then being even more careful to not frame yourself as a victim, and then do it again. Just in case. If the process of transformation and accountability makes your life hard and miserable, remember that that is not at all your victim's problem. Maybe most important of all, to me, is a willingness to lose at the game. By that I mean that if you take transformation seriously, then you have to actually let go of your attachment to the old structures in your life, including the more terrifying implications like losing friends, losing your platform, losing because you can't simultaneously transform and win. And winning, let's face it, might look like the person you wronged doing a Megan Gantz and saying, wow, you're really good at apologizing. How do you get so good at apologizing? Wow, what a hero. And then everyone around you applauds and they throw confetti and you win the award for best apologizer. And not only is all forgiven, but thanks in no small part to you, we've all learned something valuable. Well, snap out of it. Apologizing is support for someone else. It is support for the community. Being forgiven, entirely different thing. Not your business. Not something you're entitled to. We're not trying to fix everything at once here because we can't. We're breaking this down into very separate procedures because lots of very clever people constructed the best versions of justice and accountability, and it was systematized and broken down into patient steps, which was sort of stolen from. And also, because of all of the research, it seems we have fragile responses when we perceive ourselves as not having the resources to navigate making things better. So, slow the fuck down, chunk it down into steps. You'll have more resources to accomplish each step in its due course, and you can take your actual time and learn more and be better in order to patiently tackle the next step. Apologizing, framed here as a form of support for the victim and community, and as one of many transformative steps, the authenticity of which is better measured by the reality of transformation rather than your own subjective experience of emotion while you did it, can all more neatly be summed up as praxis. Apologizing is praxis. This is all praxis. All of the steps of accountability and justice are praxis. And like with all forms of praxis, you're not doing it to get gratification or praise. So if you are not forgiven, if the person you have wronged cannot and does not forgive you, if you are not sure that you have done everything you possibly can to make this thing better, true transformation beyond what you ever thought possible, you're doing it all, and the person you hurt still never, ever forgives you, cope. Because, quite frankly, you don't have to forgive shit. This is about your healing. I might be anti-forgiveness, although we'll get to that, but I am pro-healing. So once you've named the harm and sought support, just be sure to heal immediately. Let go of attachment to your victimhood. Here, have some chamomile tea. Focus on you. Really focus. Focus on your appearance and looking like you're an unstoppable tiger. Have some lapsang souchong. Concentrate on your thoughts. Positive thoughts. If you don't think positive thoughts, then you won't attract positive situations and you'll be fucked. That's science. So furrow your brow and laser focus that healing energy on the nexus of your pain. The most important thing you can do is never, ever be messy. Have a matcha latte. Is this starting to sound like a really bad idea? It doesn't even really sound like I'm pro-healing anymore, does it? I've become lost in my own playful vitriol. I'm definitely not coming for how a harmed person might like to define themselves. The actual reality of the process of healing is very subjective. The culprit that I'm actually trying to identify is the human tendency to avoid messiness. All the lengths we'll go to and the damage we'll do trying to look as if we're not messy and trying to believe we're not messy, trying to believe other people aren't messy. The status quo wants to do its status quo thing, so when some disruptive harm is done, all the social pressures are there to return to normal. There is resistance on all sides to anything being changed as a result of disruptive harm. And that resistance takes many forms. Disengagement practices happen in this context. Extrinsic emotional regulation happens. Minimization and rationalization happen. On one end of the spectrum, you have, well, that doesn't sound like that big of a deal. Maybe you weren't harmed. You're not being messy enough. And on the other end, you have, well, no one could possibly be this harmed. You're clearly a crazy person. You're being too messy. What you're ideally looking for is that sweet spot right in the middle, just enough messiness, where whatever happened to you clearly hurt, but also you're very well presented, in nice clothes with a determined if shaky demeanor. The model victim, the personification of the myth. So, well, of course, fuck that. Fuck that. I want to sing the praises of messiness, because if model victimhood is the aim of the status quo, then surely the aim of the radical is to be a glorious, untamable mess. So, have you ever had to comfort someone over something bad that's happened to them? And maybe you heard them say something like, why does it still hurt? Why am I hurt this much? Am I crazy for being in this much pain? And yeah, you want to hold them and you want holding them to work and for their pain to go away. But you also, well, I'll talk about me here. I want to say, fuck the world though. Fuck the world for this pain. Fuck the world for being this way. We have to change it. And I want to say, you know, you don't have to forgive. Forgiveness is political. Forgiveness and moving on and putting this down, that's all just more unfair burdens on you, the person who has been harmed. And also, being me, I end up talking about some post-structuralist philosophers that have thought about this, and well, that's always very comforting, isn't it? So Jacques Derrida, in his essay on cosmopolitanism and forgiveness, talks about how this whole forgiveness thing can be quite Christian, and how it lends itself to, essentially, laundering the issues. Forgiveness can disguise a power differential behind a more presentable, mature exchange. We know the power differentials in terms of our day-to-day lives and the terrible harm that can come from them. We've discussed these. They're things like patriarchy and white supremacy and the police, and so on, all that kind of stuff. But the burden of forgiveness is even more strikingly unequal on the political stage. One of Derrida's examples is South Africa, ending apartheid, and how a big part of that process was the burden of forgiveness put on Black Africans and the Peace and Reconciliation Commission headed up by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. How else, except through a political ceremony of forgiveness, were they supposed to exist in the country they lived in? Not fair. Forgiveness can also serve the function of laundering cynical and inauthentic motivations behind peacemaking while still disguising power differentials. Another example Derrida cites is Bill Clinton in the 90s pardoning Puerto Rican terrorists around exactly the same time that Hillary was running for election in New York and trying to garner Puerto Rican votes. Forgiveness is never just forgiveness. This is going to be massively relevant again very soon in the world. The burden of forgiveness will be an absurdity placed upon a deeply victimized humankind by a truly unforgivable political class. Derrida talks about the Nuremberg trials, humanity dealing in an official capacity with the horrors of the Holocaust, coming up with the term crime against humanity. Derrida puts it that even this seminal, earth-shattering event was as transactional as any other ritual of political accountability and forgiveness. A ritual with the express purpose of returning to the status quo, cleaning up the mess, and carving up the spoils of war in as respectable a fashion as possible. The Nuremberg trials may have transformed historical discourse, but also they didn't. If we look at anti-Semitism now, did the trials, this enormous display of some country's shame and this unfaltering glaring into the hearts of evil men, really do anything to protect Jewish people from anti-Semitic perception? That is, New World Order conspiracy theories and blood libel and the conspiracy that Jews run the banks and all the small-minded xenophobia across the world towards an outward appearance of Jewishness? Given that so many people seem to cling to the fantasy that if only you could go back in time and kill Hitler, you'd prevent European fascism, or that a fascist dystopia would only have happened if Germany had won. Given that we largely disregard the colonial projects of the British and other European empires, and their development of concentration camps themselves in Africa and other horrors elsewhere. In fact, their invention of race and racism, it seems the Nuremberg trials didn't have much to do with changing the world at all. Given that genocides still very much happen, sadly you can count the number of countries that have actually admitted to genocide on one Germany. And Germany, unfortunately, while it is an open book in terms of its past crimes, now has zero tolerance for dissenting voices against the latest genocide. Again, the lessons that persevered from the Nuremberg trials for Germany and the West were the ones that were compatible with continued European supremacy and Western expansion, and the sort of liberal anti-fascism that must be compatible with the global takeover of capitalism and slides inexorably towards fascism. Germany had learned that above all else, they could never be anti-Semitic again. Funnily enough, the US, UK, and Israel enshrine the definition of anti-Semitism as including any form of criticism of the state of Israel. The European Union was founded on the pretense of forgiveness in order to secure the supremacy of the West over the Soviets, over any Pan-African movement, over the Arabs in the Muslim world, over the Chinese. And meanwhile, in Britain, they created ethno-states in Israel and Pakistan and the mess of Northern Ireland, and they had to commit a few atrocities and set a few borders on fire while they were at it. The USA had their little war crimes in Vietnam and Laos and many more, and their unlawful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and many more. Genocides were carried out by Turkey, by Serbia, and it all goes unacknowledged in the preceding century, not really ever apologized for, and forgiven, so to speak, thanks to the passage of time and the pressure of international markets and nuclear bombs. As Derrida put it,
one could never, in the ordinary sense of the words, found a politics or law on forgiveness. In all the geopolitical scenes we've been talking about, the word most often abused is forgive, because it always has to do with negotiations more or less acknowledged, with calculated transactions, with conditions, and as Kant would say, with hypothetical imperatives.
And so, zooming back in, away from the political and back to the personal, we can reframe this concept of forgiveness outside of any definition that is virtuous by default, and recognize that forgiveness is as much a social lubricant as it is anything else. I would argue that it is more about the relationship between the wrongdoer and society at large than it is about the victim and their experience of harm. And so let's follow that logic for a second to address some of the other burdens of healing that fall on a victim. Like I said, why does it still hurt? The social pressure to stop hurting and get over it. Why does it hurt this much? The social pressure to downplay harm. Am I crazy for feeling this much pain? The social pressure to be normal. Fucking definitely my least favorite social pressure. The pressure to be fucking normal. Anyway, you can see from this whole essay that these social pressures can stand in the way of naming harm or beginning to heal. They can also stand in the way of seeking support. So therefore, it would be absurd, in my opinion, to try and identify the limits and aims of any given victim's personal messiness. Let me explain what I mean more directly. Trying to find a balance of how messy you are allowed to be is a socially enforced, personally damaging, counterproductive absurdity. The prevailing conception, however we justify it, is that allowing yourself to outwardly express pain, or complexity, or confusion, or to be loud, or angry, or crass, or telling the person who's seeking your forgiveness to go eat their own shit and hair, that is all indicative of a lack of healing, a refusal, perhaps, to heal. Healing is instead indicated by outward presentability, a willingness to forgive, and reintegration into social spaces. Matcha latte. But if we uncouple our assumptions about what healing looks like, I ask you simply, which of those two approaches feels more accommodating of injury? In the sense that this is injury, and laying up with a cast on is more accommodating of a broken leg than is, say, pretending to be able to drive. It was kind of a revelation, honestly, reading Derrida and Hegel and others all vying with the definition and essence of forgiveness without ever quite getting to the bit where they ask, is this even a fucking thing? Oi, hey, Michel, Gilles, Jean, is forgiveness a thing? Is forgiveness a thing? Is it useful? Can we scroll down a little bit? It's got really lost in this. They all live in an apartment together. I don't think it's unreasonable of me to be suspicious of a deontological concept-first framing of such an abstract thing as forgiveness. It's not unreasonable of me to ask, what is this forgiveness thing and what exactly is it supposed to be doing around here? When forgiveness doesn't in fact present itself as a particularly doable, doneable action in the way that, say, driving to the beach is doable or taking a shit is doneable. Many of us are walking around feeling broken. Broken for not being able to forgive. But you're not broken. You're not broken. The voices that call for model victimhood and tell you to buck up and get over it are the same that disempower you in the first place. The same that make you unsafe. The same that hold you back from justice. People want to believe that the system works. That it's just a few bad apples, that some people are just very sensitive. We've really gotten to the point where canceling people just for bad sex, they want to think all of that, and they want you to fit the narrative. What flies in the face of that narrative is rage, is shrillness, pain, sadness, anguish, all the uncompromising shrieking for change and justice if we do it together. Take your cup of ginger tea and smash it on the fucking floor. You are not broken. The world is broken. And the other people who are also victims, who also cannot do this magical thing called forgiveness, or this uncheckable to-do list of healing, will see your rage and feel comforted. Share with each other the reality of victimhood. It is profoundly better than the alternative. At least I hope so. I hope it's comforting to hear this. I hope it's comforting that we share so intimately with you. I mean, like all comfort, it's transient, you know, it fades. By all means, you watch the video again if it helps. We love when people do that. It's another view. Eventually, when the pain sets in again, and you aren't particularly inspired to be messy on your own terms, and you do inevitably wonder again, why does it still hurt? Why does it hurt this much? Am I crazy for being in this much pain? Just remember, you're not broken. You're not broken. So not broken that these words, they're yours, and they're mine, and they belong to other people watching. The conflict between being messy and wanting to be something better than messy for yourself and for everyone else, the conflict between wanting to forgive and wanting to make a point of the pain, a point that transcends the injustice of forgiveness, that dissonance that you experience, that leaves you unsure of how to occupy the very events of your own story, see, that's the most human thing there is. So congratulations, you are very much a human being. Okay, so we threw forgiveness in the bin. Whoops, sorry, not sorry. Now, can you see any potential problems with this? I mean, sure, it's all very radical and liberating. The man calls it forgiveness, but the non-binary person calls it reifying a power differential. How do you like that? But where does literally not forgiving literally leave us? Some would say, in a worried voice, it leaves us in the nebulous and stinky quagmire of moral relativism. And worse, still others would say, to reject forgiveness is, to embrace the worst aspects of hyper-individualism. I don't ever have to forgive anyone, and I don't need anyone in my life that I haven't chosen to forgive, which is alienating. It is alienating. It potentially isolates us from one another and creates obstacles between us and community. In brief, being generous. If wrongdoing is never forgiven, then the injured party and those that side with the injured party expose themselves to other additional social injuries. And you might say, but fuck it though. You were just saying fuck it, and I was saying fuck it with you. Fuck any parts of so-called community that makes itself contingent on forgiveness. Sounds like a bunch of liberal hooey for liberals. We shouldn't have to accept apologies from apologists, which is valid. Genuinely, I'm not presenting a new argument if I say that things can be worse for you if you don't forgive. I'm just restating that because we're social animals and we rely on other people and we have to obey social rules, an unequal society makes obeying those social rules, including forgiveness, deeply unfair. The fact that you had to obey those rules was the thing that exposed you to the initial harm in the first place, which is frustrating, but it might be valuable, given all of that, to dig a little deeper into what we might make out of forgiveness, what role some new third thing could serve, since, after all, and I'm sorry to remind you, society is the thing that you live in. And honestly, in my opinion, there's already enough faux liberatory content out there that panders to the sort of individualistic pop psychology solipsism where your value is so valuable that you shouldn't value anyone that doesn't value your value. So let's just redefine the term boundary so it keeps you from ever having any fucking responsibility. I do not wish forgiveness out of existence simply because we like when we are unburdened from things. I want to examine what it is we're trying to accomplish outside of the domain of some normative Western habit, because we need each other, and that need can be really fucking messy. Plus, look, hey, we changed the color scheme again. We've switched points of view, so now we're looking at this from the perspective of the wrongdoer, and they surely are the ones with the greater responsibility to reinvent the wheel of forgiveness. Surely. What do you do when you're the one who is royally fucked up, but the blue-haired woke skulls went and abolished forgiveness? What do indeed? In her book on repentance and repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World, author and Rabbi Daniel Ruttenberg uses an example of a dying Nazi seeking forgiveness from a Jewish prisoner in the Janowska concentration camp. A true story. They brought this guy in, Simon Wiesenthal, who'd been an architect before the war, as an arbitrary stand-in for all Jewish people. And this Nazi, who's on his deathbed, confesses all the terrible things he's done.
An unspeakable mass murder of 300 Jews, a burning alive of innocents, of children. He expressed great remorse for his actions and his abetting of profound evil. He told Simon that he would be willing to suffer great agonies if he could only find a way to bring back the dead. As Simon later recounted, he was a dying man, a murderer, who did not want to be a murderer, but who had been made into a murderer by a murderous ideology. He was confessing his crimes to a man who perhaps tomorrow must die at the hands of these same murderers. In his confession, there was true repentance, even though he did not admit it in so many words. The dying Nazi begged Simon's forgiveness as a Jew, on behalf of the Jews that he had murdered. Simon Wiesenthal stood up, considered the question for a few moments, and then he walked out the room without a word.
When we coerce with something like forgiveness, we do not necessarily know that we are coercing. We participate in systems of oppression without remotely understanding our place in them. We're only really witness to the pain and struggle and accomplishment of our own lives that we ourselves have lived, and everything else is something we have to take someone else's word for. So coerced forgiveness is not just ugly. It's not just dangerous, although it is dangerous, as I said earlier on, and it can even be a factor in perpetuating situations of abuse. But coerced forgiveness is more than just ugly and dangerous. It's also functionally indistinguishable from quote-unquote real forgiveness, from that which has not been coerced or unequally demanded. And it's important that we understand that most of us simultaneously have a wrongdoing is wrong narrative while holding on to other narratives that make wrongdoing very difficult to actually fucking identify and take responsibility for. Various studies on spousal abuse, for example, show that justifications for abuse often amount to the batterer saying, "I wanted to be treated better." Whether that's an expression of boiling over frustration with her bad behavior, or it's the abuser perceiving themselves as justifiably retaliating. Again and again, I will say this, in the process of addressing and repairing harm, keep checking how much of a victim you have made yourself in your own head. In any case, the idea of "I deserve to be forgiven" is, as the kids say, a big old red flag, because it's not how forgiveness works. The origins of the word forgive would seem to be the same as the origins of the word gift, and that's got to be a bit of a clue. Forgiveness is not something you attain or seek or demand. It is instead an offering, an act of generosity from the forgiver to the forgivee. So even if you did something truly awful to someone, under a forgiveness system, it's structured so none of us can socially move on beyond the infraction until the person who's been wronged goes to the effort of making a gift of forgiveness. A forgiveness system is, therefore, unfair. And also, it's arbitrary. See, I've outlined my issue with Derrida and others presuming that forgiveness has some essence, or at least failing to sufficiently interrogate its essential ontology, instead of what they could have been doing, which is looking at these social phenomena as separate and often irreconcilable processes. You have an injured party trying to heal, and so therefore needing a safer and better world, and a mistake maker who wants to be reintegrated into the status quo of normal world as it was before the mistake. He told Simon that he would be willing to suffer great agonies if he could only find a way to bring back the dead. Well, he can't. They're fucking dead. And Simon Wiesenthal did the right thing by walking out of the room in silence. So if we take the reasonable approach and scrutinize that end goal of reintegration over here and find it a bit lacking and lame in terms of moral action, then what else could the mistake maker do or attempt to do instead of laundering themselves? Or what else could socially and ritualistically mark the end of a process of repentance and repair? Well, even if you're the sort of person that gets tremendously upset and obsessed about finding the real, true moral act, you know, if you're autistic like me, you might find blowing up the forgiveness system harder than it seems. You're working against a really ingrained kind of normativity. You're working against a largely Christian concept. The way that forgiveness plays out in the West is an extension of Christian normativity. And what sucks is that there are aspects of this forgiveness system that are as disruptive to justice for the injured party as they are for the person who did the harm. Much like the pseudo-self-forgiveness that Sarah described earlier on, pseudo-extrinsic forgiveness can leave us worse off. For example, when it comes to forgiveness, there are issues of self-consistency. The philosopher Wendell O'Brien breaks it down in his essay, How Not to Forgive.
Recall Jesus' teaching about forgiving your brother not just 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. It's hard to imagine how anyone forgiving the brother for, say, the 390th time for the same darn thing could take anything he says as evidence of sincere sorrow and resolution to change. and yet the Christian is supposed to forgive him anyway, and 100 more times if necessary. The only people you can ordinarily extract a real apology from are decent fellows. It's easy to forgive them because they obviously feel bad about what they've done to you, and it wasn't really very bad after all. Most people, by contrast, have an irritating tendency to persist in the belief that they haven't done anything wrong. If they did something bad to you, they think you deserve it. This is particularly true of the vilest characters, who generally apologize only under advice from their attorneys in order to avoid the gallows, in which case you tend to doubt their sincerity. If you forgave only the genuinely sorry, you would rarely exercise your forgiving organ, and when you did, you wouldn't give it much of a workout.
If what you've done is easily forgiven, you're not in much need of the gift of forgiveness. If what you've done is hard to forgive, then you must leave the injured party with full agency over the gift of forgiveness. Seeking it erodes that agency. Being entitled to it erodes the meaningfulness of it. O'Brien also points out that to forgive is to judge. I judge you worthy of my forgiveness. Better to say forget about it, or admit that this is a rare, strange gift for people who've really earned it.
You're really mad at forgiveness.
Yeah, I'm angry about it, I think.
What's going on there?
I mean, what do you mean? I'm mad at politics and social dynamics. Well, I'll do my mindfulness exercises and I'll get back to you. So, okay, but the question, what would a ritual of return look like if not, I forgive you? Well, I'm probably overstating it a little bit by calling it a ritual, but then again, what is a ritual? Like, what are rituals for? I think we kind of need certain things to be a bit more sacred from time to time and a little bit less defined by the forces of litigation, one-upmanship, and sarcasm. So we have to focus on the important things here. The focus for the injured party should be on healing themselves. So then maybe the focus for the injurer should be healing the world. We should go through the processes of restitution and accountability, engage with whatever restorative justice process might be at hand, consensually engage with the injured party if that is something they want. But our focus should be on transforming the world and preventing further harm for everyone. Essentially, making the consequences of the bad thing into even more of a responsibility for good. And not because you're proving yourself or whatever, but instead because that's what goodness is. Say, for example, a police officer who quit the force to become a former police officer who maybe grew up in a murderous ideology and maybe had some of the old problematic views and maybe even made some mistakes along the way. Let's just call him, I don't know, Phil. Well, what Phil could do to make a bad thing good is use his awareness of that system to fight that system, to educate people on abolishing that system. Use all the insight of bad as intel for good, and become something new and unprecedented as a consequence of injuries that he can't go back in time and erase. And no one is obliged to say, I forgive you to Phil. No one needs to validate or judge, and no one has an obligation to be forgiving or take on the labor of having a forgiving attitude to the police. Not for Phil, because Phil knows that good is a thing you do, a thing that you do quite separate from validation. The community around us doesn't exist to validate us. It exists for... So look at that. It's time to talk about love.
Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
I think I'd prefer to frame this more in terms of community rather than love. It feels a little more purposeful to me.
Well, don't tell me, tell them.
I grew a garden last summer. I grew tomatillos, spaghetti squash, and shiso, things that I can't get in Irish grocery stores. Snails ate my artichoke shoots. A neighbor thought I was growing summer squash and picked all of the spaghetti squash before they were ripe. I didn't realize that asparagus needs to grow a few years before you can eat it. And towards the end of the summer, the humidity in my greenhouse pretty much killed everything else.
To be fair, the shiso was very good.
I hear a lot of people say that they'd love to move to the country and buy a farm and grow their own food. I think a lot of us are humble enough to know that the work of growing food is much harder than we probably think, but I don't think many of us appreciate the science that goes into farming. And I don't mean this sort of like GMO, so it takes pesticides better science, but the hundreds of years of knowledge on how to replenish the soil and keep away pests and mold, account for different weather conditions. I worked at the USDA seed bank in my early 20s on a project on cryopreservation of graft specimens of plants, because there are so many fruits that we can't reliably grow with seeds. Apples, avocados, grapes, pears, oranges, all of these fruits are propagated by grafts or cuttings, by making clones rather than planting seeds. If instead of cloning, you try to plant a seed, a plant will grow, but it probably won't produce fruit that tastes any good. Like, are you familiar with Johnny Appleseed? Believe it or not, he was a real person, and he sounded great in many ways, someone with a utopian vision for our future, but he was anti-grafting and responsible for planting apple orchards all over the US, but while the trees grew, the apples they grew were largely inedible. Apples good for nothing more than alcoholic cider, as Michael Pollan put it.
Really, what Johnny Appleseed was doing, and the reason he was welcome in every cabin in Ohio and Indiana, was he was bringing the gift of alcohol to the frontier. He was our American Dionysus. I want to do the quote reads sometimes.
This essay has proposed two frameworks: how to heal from hurt and how to repair having hurt. But here's the prestige. Neither the victim nor perpetrator can do it alone. Obviously, because we need therapists and moderators to step in, but also pragmatically, because without community, why bother engaging? Why be a good person? Why not just think about yourself? It's easier.
Right now, frequently, people are reformed by time. They hang around long enough and people soften. They forget. I've seen this time and again in small town Ireland where the dating pool is very limited. In the big time YouTube creator sphere where the white guy leftist content is just too mediocre to pass up. And people are complicated. It can be easier to look at the ways a perpetrator is funny or talented or good company and forget or minimize the things that they've done. Hey, Woody Allen is still married to Soon Yi. Maybe it's okay that he groomed one daughter and raped the other. After all, that means you can watch Vicky Cristina Barcelona and Annie Hall and just appreciate the talent without worrying about anything. At least not until his victim has to post a scathing, traumatizing private letter about her assault, and all of us with a conscience look down at our hands and wonder if we're complicit. This is part of the mechanism that I think we misattribute as forgiveness. God gave us forgiveness, just like he gave us all of the beasts of land and sea. But as it turns out, the passage of time might have been responsible for both. I would like to propose, and I think this is what you were getting at, that we are, all of us, complicit. We always hear the "we live in a society, society is the thing we live in, society" thing. But usually it's proposed in that limiting way, where it means we can't do anything, or expect better, or make meaningful change. This is the opposite. This is, we live in a society, and whatever we live in will be a society. So let's treat it as such. Let's make it our individual, immediate responsibility to take care of one another collectively. We have the opportunity to set the standards for the people we align with, for the people we become, for the outcomes we actually want. And they should be fair, and they should be negotiated, and no doubt will be the subject of much colourful, vibrant, tanky-on anarchist debate. But right now, there isn't enough of a debate, nor certainly of an infrastructure for any of this stuff. So let's start.
However, that doesn't just mean that we can go ad hoc. There are people who have spent their entire careers studying moderation and therapeutic practices. There are people across different disciplines. Much of our framework was borrowed from Rabbi Daniel Ruttenberg's appraisal of Jewish philosopher Maimonides. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. But the worst thing we can do is be arrogant about that and think that we can muddle through something like restorative justice without any training or framework. And if you're someone seeking a restorative system, don't trust anyone who thinks they can just jump in and DIY therapy or moderation. Those are the same smug assholes who think that teachers are just failed creatives and don't understand that pedagogy is an entire field of science, or think that they're too smart and slick to get tricked by propaganda. But likewise, don't think that because you are ignorant, it means that you aren't responsible. Because we are going to hurt, and we are going to be hurt. And as much as we need pathways of healing for victims, we need pathways for reintegration for penitent perpetrators. Because otherwise, we leave it to the passage of time or to a criminal justice system which makes examples out of some perpetrators while excusing others and brutalizing victims in the process. Everyone watching this video knows that the system is bad. So why don't we create something else? A collaborative way of holding ourselves and each other accountable, not under threat of incarceration, but out of a devotion to each other. Or as Neil would put it, love.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the thought experiment at the start of this video is kind of bullshit. Like, the injustice we carve out and reproduce is solipsistic. As soon as we think of others in any way, like victims or community, even our long-term future selves, suddenly justice is what we want. To me, love, the thing you do, the practical, responsible tool that we call love, is the force of change. I have to change and be humble and get over myself and reinvent responsibly, constantly, in order to both heal and protect. To heal is to protect. Like the data that shows that attending to substance use, taking care of yourself honestly, leads to doing a far less shitty job of taking care of others. Or the small practices of self-care that the victim and perpetrator actually share in common. Or the responsibility to change shitty attitudes that the whole community shares together. Even down to that aside you made about a snake oil salesman and easy answers. I think on some level we kind of know when something really is self-love and when it actually isn't. I mean, look, I love you. And every damn day I have to improve and change and figure us out and evolve and be accountable and say sorry. And every damn day you have to do the same thing. And it's like a pressure cooker of self-development sometimes, but it's worth it. Because that same force of change, force of honesty, force of justice, force of goodness, force of love, is the same thing that lays next to me and keeps me warm in the darkness. As exhausted as I feel sometimes from feeling judged and challenged and not good enough and like, why can't you just agree that I'm done and I'm a good person who deserves love on my own solipsistic terms? As much as my fucking legs buckle under the pressure of true love, I'll still pick myself up and do it again tomorrow. Because that's still the path I choose.
Well, we should cheers to that.
Cheers to what specifically?
I don't know. I never know what our essays are really about.